The weight of two worlds. The morning light hadn't yet broken through the clouds when Josephine Alvarez's alarm cut through the silence of her small apartment. She blinked away exhaustion, allowing herself exactly 15 seconds before swinging, her legs over the edge of the bed. The wooden floor felt cold against her bare feet as she padded to her daughter's room. "Mia, sweetheart," Joe whispered, gently brushing dark curls from her daughter's forehead. "Time to get ready." The 8-year-old stirred reluctantly, her eyes fluttering open with the same warm brown as her mother's. "Is it morning already?" "I'm afraid so," Joe smiled, even as she calculated the day ahead. "Drop Mia at Mrs. Patterson's for before-school care by 6:30. Start her shift at Riverside Market by 7 so. Work until 2 ao. Pick up Mia from after-school program by 3 ao. Spend 2 precious hours with her daughter. Drop Mia at neighbor Teresa's by 5:30. Then wait tables at Bluebird Diner until midnight." By 6:15 they were hurrying down the street, Joe's uniform for the market already on beneath her worn coat. Mia clutched her backpack, chattering about her science project while Joe made mental notes about which bills were most pressing this month. "Mom, are you listening?" Mia tugged at her hand. "Sorry, honey. Tell me again about the planets." Mrs. Patterson greeted them with a knowing nod. The older woman had been a godsend since Joe's ex-husband Daniel had walked out 3 years ago, leaving nothing but debts and broken promises. Joe kissed Mia's forehead, whispered, "Be brilliant," and hurried toward Riverside Market. The market was already buzzing when Joe tied on her apron. Her manager Hector nodded approvingly at her punctuality. Joe's reliability had earned her the coveted morning shift, allowing her the afternoon break to see Mia before the diner job began. "Morning rush coming in," Hector warned as Joe stocked the fresh bread. "New delivery schedule means we're short-handed until 10. Joe nodded, already shifting into the efficient rhythm that had become second nature. She worked methodically, scanning groceries, stocking shelves, helping elderly customers reach high items, all while maintaining the warm smile that never revealed the bone-deep fatigue beneath it. The day at Riverside passed in a blur of activity. At precisely 2 hours, Joe hung up her apron and rushed toward Oak Ridge Elementary, where Mia waited with stories about fractions and playground politics. These stolen hours were sacred. They did homework together, prepared dinner for Mia to eat later, and shared the simple joy of being together before Joe had to leave again. By 5:45, Joe was tying on a different apron at Bluebird Diner, a small establishment with faded booths and reliable comfort food. Tuesday nights were usually slow, which meant fewer tips but less physical demand. She'd learned to be grateful for the balance. "Table 6 needs menus," Fran, the other waitress, called out as Joe clocked in. Joe grabbed the laminated menus and approached the corner booth where a man sat alone, staring out the rain-streaked window. Something about his stillness caught her attention, not the restless impatience of most solo diners but a quiet contemplation. "Welcome to Bluebird," Joe said, placing the menu before him. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Gabriel Pearson looked up, momentarily startled from his thoughts. The waitress before him had dark circles beneath her eyes but smiled with genuine warmth. Something about that authentic kindness amid obvious exhaustion struck him. "Just coffee, please," he said, his voice quiet from disuse. Gabriel wasn't accustomed to dining in modest establishments like this. His usual meals happened in sleek restaurants, where staff were trained to be invisible, or alone in his expansive penthouse overlooking the city. But tonight, driving through unfamiliar streets to avoid returning to his empty home, the glowing sign of Bluebird Diner had beckoned him. As the waitress, Josephine according to her name tag, returned with his coffee, Gabriel noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the way she straightened her shoulders before approaching each table, as though physically preparing herself to carry more than just plates. "Ready to order?" she asked, pen poised above her notepad. "What do you recommend?" Gabriel asked, realizing he hadn't even opened the menu. Something flickered across her face, surprise at being asked her opinion perhaps, before she responded. "The meatloaf is honest food, nothing fancy but it satisfies." Gabriel nodded. "Then that's what I'll have." As Josephine walked away, Gabriel found himself wondering about her story. In his world of investment portfolios and business acquisitions, he rarely considered the lives of those who served him, but something about this woman's dignified exhaustion resonated with a loneliness he rarely acknowledged. The diner gradually emptied as the evening progressed. Gabriel lingered over his meal, which was indeed satisfying in its simplicity. He watched as Josephine moved between tables, offering refills and checking on customers with genuine attention, rather than rehearsed phrases. When she brought his check, Gabriel left a generous tip without ostentation. He didn't want gratitude or attention. Something just compelled him to acknowledge her efforts in the only way he currently knew how. As he stepped back into the rainy night, Gabriel realized he felt slightly less hollow than when he had entered. Perhaps, he thought, he would return tomorrow. Small kindnesses. Gabriel found himself returning to the Bluebird Diner the following evening, and then again 2 nights later. Each visit, he requested Josephine's section, though he never explained why. There was something compelling about her, quiet strength that drew him back, an authenticity he rarely encountered in his carefully curated world of wealth and strategic relationships. On his 4th visit, he arrived earlier than usual and noticed Josephine, Jo, as he'd heard the other, staff caller, handling a phone call at the counter, her face tight with worry. "I understand, Ms. Winters," Jo was saying, "but Mia has so much potential. Isn't there any program with financial aid?" She listened, shoulders slumping slightly. "Yes, I appreciate you considering us. Thank you." When she approached his table, minutes later, her professional smile was firmly back in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Back again?" she asked, pouring his coffee without being asked. "You must really like our meatloaf." Gabriel offered a small smile. "It reminds me of something I've been missing." He hesitated, then added, "Everything all right? You seemed concerned on the phone." Jo looked startled, then composed herself. "Just parenting challenges. Nothing unusual." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "The usual tonight?" He nodded, watching as she walked away. Gabriel had built his fortune by observing patterns and identifying needs, skills that had served him well in business, but left his personal life barren. Now those same observational skills drew a picture of Jo's life from fragments. The worn edges of her shoes, the careful way she counted her tips, how she saved the slightly stale dinner rolls in her apron pocket rather than throwing them away. Over the next 2 weeks, Gabriel established a routine, Tuesdays and Thursdays at the Bluebird, where he learned Jo worked evening shifts. He began frequenting Riverside Market on Monday mornings too, ostensibly to buy groceries but really to observe Jo in her other environment. She moved differently, there, more businesslike, efficient, but still with that fundamental kindness that seemed intrinsic to her nature. Their interactions remained brief, but gradually warmed. Gabriel mentioned books he'd enjoyed. Jo recommended her favorites. He noticed she had an unexpected passion for astronomy, knowledge gleaned from helping her daughter with science projects. "Mia wants to be an astronaut," Jo explained one quiet evening, refilling his coffee. "She has these big dreams of exploring other planets." "That's wonderful," Gabriel said, genuinely moved by the pride in Jo's voice. "The world needs more dreamers," or smiled, a real smile that transformed her tired face. "That's what I tell her. Dream big, work hard." She glanced at the clock. "Speaking of which, duty calls." Gabriel began making small, unobtrusive changes to his routine that he hoped might ease Jo's burdens without drawing attention. He learned that Tuesday mornings were when Riverside Market received fresh produce, so he began stopping by to purchase fruit, casually leaving behind the ripest apples and oranges with a murmured, "For your daughter, if she likes these." At the diner, he timed his meals for Jo's break periods, encouraging her to sit momentarily while he finished his coffee, creating brief respites in her long shifts. They discussed simple topics, weather, local events, books they'd read, nothing personal, yet Gabriel found these moments inexplicably fulfilling. One rainy Thursday, Gabriel overheard Joe speaking urgently with Fran near the kitchen. Teresa's sick and Mrs. Patterson has that church thing tonight. I don't know who else to call. Can't Mia's father help? Fran asked. Joe's face hardened. Daniel hasn't answered a call in 8 months. Gabriel pretended to be absorbed in his newspaper when Joe approached with his check. Leaving early tonight? She asked, noticing he'd barely touched his dessert. Actually, Gabriel said carefully, I couldn't help overhearing. You need someone to watch your daughter? Joe stiffened immediately. We're fine, thank you. I'm sorry. He backtracked, recognizing her maternal caution. That was presumptuous. I just meant perhaps I could help somehow. Call a service, maybe? Joe's expression softened slightly. That's kind, but I'll figure it out. I always do. Gabriel nodded, respecting her boundaries while admiring her fierce independence. After paying, he left but remained in his car across the street, making a call to a colleague who owed him a favor. 20 minutes later, a woman entered the diner and approached Joe. Gabriel watched through the window as the woman introduced herself as a representative from Community Child Care Solutions, explaining they had an emergency placement available if needed. Joe's suspicious expression gradually eased as she verified the woman's credentials. From his car, Gabriel saw Joe's relief as she made a call, presumably to Mia, before returning to work with lighter steps. The next Tuesday at the market, Joe approached. Him in the produce section. You had something to do with community childcare, didn't you? Her tone wasn't accusatory, merely curious. Gabriel considered lying, but found he couldn't. I know someone on their board. I mentioned there was a hardworking parent who might need their services. Joe studied him. Why? The question caught him off guard. In his world, motives were always clear: profit, advantage, leverage. Because everyone deserves help sometimes, he finally said, and your daughter shouldn't miss having you around because systems fail. Joe remained quiet for a long moment. Thank you, she finally said. Mia loved their learning center. They even helped with her astronomy project. This small acceptance of his help filled Gabriel with unexpected warmth. He'd donated millions to charities over the years, but none of those tax-deductible gestures had felt as significant as this moment. As autumn deepened, Gabriel learned that Mia struggled with mathematics and needed specialized tutoring, the reason for Joe's worried phone call weeks earlier. The program cost was modest to someone of Gabriel's means, but represented an impossible luxury for Joe. Through careful maneuvering and an anonymous donation to the tutoring center's scholarship fund, Gabriel arranged for Mia to receive a randomly selected full scholarship. When Joe mentioned this stroke of luck during one of their brief conversations, her face luminous with joy, Gabriel experienced a satisfaction deeper than any business success had ever provided. His own life began shifting, subtly. His penthouse, once a showcase of expensive minimalism, now contained actual groceries from Riverside Market. He found himself reading the astronomy books he purchased for his niece before passing them to Joe for Mia. His assistant noted with surprise that he had begun declining evening business meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays without explanation. What to you? Gabriel couldn't acknowledge, even to himself, was how these small kindnesses were filling a void he'd never properly identified. The gratitude in Joe's tired eyes when he listened to her stories about Mia, the genuine way she asked about his day. These simple human connections were reconstructing something essential he hadn't realized was missing. One evening at the diner, as Joe refilled his coffee, she paused. You know, she said thoughtfully, for someone who comes here so often, I realize I know almost nothing about you. Gabriel looked up, suddenly aware of how carefully he'd maintained this imbalance. Learning about her life while revealing little of his own. Not much to tell, he said with a small smile. Work keeps me busy. What kind of work? Joe asked, her genuine interest catching him off guard. Gabriel hesitated. The truth, that he was CEO of Pearson Investments with holdings worth billions, would irreparably change their dynamic. Financial consulting, he said instead, the partial truth sitting uncomfortably on his tongue. Joe nodded. That explains the suits. I figured you were someone important. Not particularly, Gabriel replied, feeling the weight of his omission. As Joe moved to another table, Gabriel contemplated the precarious nature of what he'd begun. These small kindnesses had created a connection he increasingly valued, yet it was built on a significant omission. Eventually, he knew, the truth would emerge, and then what? Would Joe see his help as manipulation? Would she feel deceived? Now though, he simply watched her work, recognizing that in trying to lighten her burdens he had unexpectedly lightened his own. The storm and shelter. The first warnings about the approaching storm system appeared as small crawlers on the bottom of weather reports. Gabriel noticed them during his morning coffee routine, now punctuated by texts to his assistant rescheduling, meetings to accommodate his visits to Riverside Market and the Bluebird Diner. By afternoon, the warnings had escalated to urgent advisories. Significant flooding expected. Residents in low-lying areas should prepare for evacuation. Gabriel knew that Pinewood Apartments, where Joe and Mia lived, sat in one of those low-lying areas near the river. The aging complex had flooded during less severe weather events in the past. His knowledge of this detail should have felt intrusive, but his concern overrode any hesitation about how much he'd learned about Joe's life through careful observation and discreet questions. When he arrived at the Bluebird that evening, the diner was eerily empty. Rain already pounded against the windows and wind rattled the old building's frame. Joe looked up in surprise when he entered, water droplets sliding from his coat onto the freshly mopped floor. "You came out in this?" she asked, abandoning the silverware she'd been rolling. "They're saying it's going to be the worst storm in 20 years. Gabriel shrugged out of his wet coat. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Something flickered across Joe's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, at the implications of his concern. Over the past 2 months, their interactions had evolved from server and customer to something resembling friendship, though both carefully maintained certain boundaries. "Fran and I are closing early," Joe explained, gesturing to the empty diner. "Hector already called to say the market will be closed tomorrow." Her expression tightened. "Which means no hours, no pay." Gabriel nodded, understanding the calculations already running through her mind. "Do you and Mia have somewhere safe to stay tonight? The evacuation orders, and we'll be fine," Joe interrupted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mrs. Patterson has a second-floor apartment. She said we could stay if things get bad." Thunder crashed overhead, making the lights flicker ominously. Joe's phone rang and her face paled as she listened. "When?" she asked, turning away from Gabriel. "How many units? Yes, I understand. Thank you for calling." When she hung up, her composure had cracked slightly. That was the property manager. "The river's already breached the lower parking lot. They're evacuating the first 3 buildings now, including ours." Gabriel watched her hands, always steady despite exhaustion, tremble slightly as she untied her apron. "I need to get to Mia. Teresa has her, but her place is across town. I can drive you," Gabriel offered immediately. "My car is parked close." Joe hesitated, weighing necessity against propriety. Another crash of thunder decided for her. "Let me tell Fran." The drive to Teresa's house was tense, windshield wipers barely keeping pace with the deluge. Joe sat rigid beside him, staring through, the rain-streaked windows occasionally directing him with terse instructions. Gabriel kept his focus on the road, aware of how unusual this situation was. Joe in his personal space, the carefully maintained distance between them temporarily, suspended by emergency. Teresa lived in a small duplex 20 minutes away. By the time they arrived, the streets were beginning to flood in low spots. Joe rushed inside while Gabriel waited, watching sheets of rain dance across his windshield and considering options he knew Joe wouldn't want to hear. When she emerged with Mia, a small figure with her mother's dark curls and serious eyes, Gabriel stepped out to help with the backpacks and a plastic container that presumably held something precious enough to rescue from a potential flood. "Mom says you're Mr. Gabriel from the diner," Mia said as she climbed into the back seat, studying him with unfiltered curiosity. "She says you know about the stars, too." "Mia," Joe warned gently, helping her with the seatbelt. "I'm still learning," Gabriel replied, smiling at the child. "Your mother tells me you're the real expert." As they drove back toward the evacuation zone, Joe's phone buzzed with updates from neighbors. The news grew increasingly concerning. Water was already entering first-floor units. The emergency shelter at the high school was overcrowded, and the rain showed no signs of abating. "Mrs. Patterson isn't answering," Joe said after her third attempt, worry evident in her voice. "I don't know if she's already left." Gabriel took a deep breath. "I have a place you can stay," he said carefully. "It's secure above any flood zone and has plenty of room." Joe turned to him, suspicion immediately replacing worry. "Your place?" "An investment property," Gabriel clarified, the half-truth again, sitting uncomfortably. "I keep it ready for business associates, but it's empty now." He glanced at her. "Just until the evacuation order lifts." "Mom, I'm scared." Mia's small voice came from the back seat. "Mr. Orozco said his cat almost drowned last time." Joe closed her eyes briefly. Gabriel recognized the internal struggle, her fierce independence warring with practical necessity. Finally, she nodded once, a sharp movement conveying both acceptance and reluctance. The investment property was, in fact, Gabriel's second home, a spacious 3-bedroom condominium in the city's safest, highest elevation neighborhood. As he led them from the underground garage to the private elevator, Gabriel noted Joe's increasingly suspicious glances. When the elevator opened directly into a foyer with soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the storm-darkened city below, Joe stopped abruptly. "This isn't just an investment property, is it?" Her voice was quiet but firm. Gabriel met her gaze directly. "It's one of my homes. I thought it would be more comfortable than a hotel." "Wow," Mia exclaimed already, exploring the spacious living area, momentarily distracting Joe from her rising indignation. "There are 3 bedrooms," Gabriel continued, keeping his tone neutral. "You and Mia can have complete privacy. I'll stay in the guest room down the hall, or I can leave entirely, if you prefer. The choice is yours." Joe studied him, calculating. "Why didn't you just say this was your place from the beginning? Would you have agreed to come if I had?" The honest question hung between them. Joe finally sighed, some tension leaving her shoulders. "Probably not." Gabriel showed them to the main bedroom suite, where Mia immediately bounced on the king-size bed with undisguised delight. Joe watched her daughter, a reluctant smile softening her expression, despite her evident discomfort with the situation. "There, our clothes in the closet," Gabriel said. "Nothing fancy, but dry at least. Help yourselves to anything you need. The kitchen is fully stocked." "These aren't business associate accommodations," Joe observed, glancing around at the clearly personal touches. Books lining shelves, a telescope positioned near the windows. Gabriel simply nodded, not denying the obvious. "I'll give you privacy. If you need anything, I'll be in the kitchen." Later, after Mia had been settled in clean borrowed clothes, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, and was happily exploring a collection of science books Gabriel had forgotten he owned, Joe joined him in the kitchen. She had changed into a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, both too large but dry. "She's asleep," Joe said, hovering at the counter's edge. The excitement wore her out. Gabriel nodded, sliding a mug of tea toward her. "There's news about your building. The first floor is completely flooded. They're saying at least 3 days before residents can return to assess damage." Joe's face crumpled momentarily before she regained control. "Everything we have is there. I'm sorry," Gabriel said, meaning it more deeply than the simple words conveyed. They sat in silence, the storm's fury muffled by the expensive windows and solid construction. Finally, Joe looked up at him directly. "Who are you, really? All these months, these small kindnesses, the childcare, Mia's tutoring scholarship that appeared out of nowhere. Was it all you?" Gabriel considered denying it, but found he couldn't lie to her directly. "Would it matter if it was?" "Of course it matters," Joe replied, her voice tight with emotion. "Either you're just a kind stranger who happened to be in the right place repeatedly, or you're someone with resources who's been—" "What? Playing some kind of game?" "Not a game," Gabriel said quietly. "Never that." "Then what?" Gabriel stared into his own untouched tea. How could he explain what he barely understood himself, that in her quiet dignity and unwavering determination, he had recognized something essential that his wealth had insulated him from for too long? "I've spent my life building walls," he finally said. "Success made isolation easy to justify, but watching you, how hard you work, how completely you love your daughter, how you maintain kindness despite everything, it reminded me of what matters." Joe's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained. "You still haven't told me who you really are." Gabriel met her gaze. "My name is Gabriel Pearson. I'm CEO of Pearson Investments. And yes, I have resources that could make your life easier in material ways. But that's not why I kept coming back." Joe's eyes widened slightly at the name, not well known to the general public perhaps, but recognizable enough in business circles. "Why did you keep coming back?" The question hung between them, demanding an honesty Gabriel hadn't offered anyone in years. "Because you were the first person in a very long time who saw me. Not what I could provide, not what I represented. Just me." Outside, lightning illuminated the storm-tossed city. Inside, in the warm kitchen of a home that had never felt lived in until this moment, something shifted between two people who had been orbiting each other for months. Both carrying burdens the other only partially understood. "Mia has school Monday," Joe finally said, an oblique acceptance of their current situation. "Assuming they reopen after the storm." Gabriel nodded, understanding her implicit agreement to stay until then. "Of course, I'll help you both get wherever you need to go." As Joe stood to return to her daughter, she paused. "Gabriel, thank you, not just for tonight, but for all of it. Even the parts I'm still not sure how I feel about." In that moment of raw honesty, with rain lashing against windows and uncertainty stretching before them both, Gabriel realized that in trying to help Joe weather her storms, he had inadvertently found shelter from his own. Hidden Truths 3 days. Stretched into 5 as floodwaters receded with agonizing slowness, the unexpected cohabitation established its own peculiar rhythm. Joe insisted on cooking meals despite Gabriel's protests. Mia commandeered the telescope with delighted enthusiasm, and Gabriel found himself working from home rather than the office, claiming poor road conditions while actually cherishing the transformed atmosphere of his usually sterile living space. On the 4th morning, Gabriel emerged from his bedroom to find Mia sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by paper and colored pencils. "What are you creating?" he asked, pouring himself coffee from the pot Joe had already prepared before leaving for an emergency meeting with her landlord. "It's the Andromeda Galaxy," Mia explained seriously, not looking up from her careful coloring. "Did you know it's going to crash into our galaxy someday?" Gabriel smiled, settling into a nearby chair. "Is that right?" "Mm-hmm. But not for billions of years, so we don't have to worry." She selected a purple pencil, adding spiraling detail. "Mom says we have enough to worry about right now without galaxy crashes." The honesty of children never failed to humble Gabriel, who had spent decades in a world where directness was considered a liability. "Your mom is very wise," Mia nodded, finally looking up. "She works really hard. Sometimes she falls asleep helping with my homework." Her eyes, so like Joe's, studied him with disarming perception. "Are you rich?" The blunt question startled a laugh from him. "What makes you ask that?" Mia gestured around them. "This place is bigger than our whole apartment building, and you have a telescope that moves by itself with buttons." "The apartment is just a thing," Gabriel said carefully. "It doesn't make me any better or more important than anyone else." Mia considered this with adorable seriousness. "But you could buy any cereal you want, even the expensive kind." "I suppose that's true," Gabriel acknowledged, struck by the child's practical perspective on wealth. "Mom always gets the store brand," Mia continued, returning to her drawing. "She says it tastes the same, but it doesn't, not really." These small revelations about Joe's life, the everyday compromises and gentle deceptions parents craft to shield their children from financial worries, affected Gabriel more deeply than any business negotiation ever had. The conversation ended abruptly when Mia's attention shifted to a documentary about space exploration. Gabriel retreated to his home office, where he found himself making calls not about investment portfolios, but about recovery resources for flood-affected neighborhoods. Jo returned shortly after noon, her expression tight with contained emotion. Gabriel met her in the foyer, immediately recognizing the storm behind her carefully controlled facade. "How bad?" he asked simply. "Everything on the first floor is destroyed," Jo said, her voice flat. "Water damage, mold already starting. They're condemning half the building, including our unit. We have 20 minutes with a safety escort to retrieve what we can tomorrow morning." Gabriel watched her hands, those capable, always busy hands, clench and unclench at her sides. "I'm so sorry, Jo." She nodded mechanically, then asked, "Where's Mia?" "Watching a space documentary. I promised her lunch in 15 minutes. Jo relaxed slightly, gratitude flashing across her features. "Thank you for not letting her see me like this." They stood in silence for a moment before Jo straightened her shoulders in that familiar way Gabriel had first noticed at the diner. The physical preparation to carry more weight. "I should start looking for a new place, with the housing shortage since the tech boom and deposits being what they are." She trailed off, calculations clearly running behind her eyes. "Stay here," Gabriel said impulsively. "Until you find somewhere perfect. No rush, no pressure." Jo's expression shuddered immediately. "We've imposed enough." "It's not an imposition," Gabriel insisted. "This place has never felt more like home than it has these past few days." The raw honesty of his statement hung between them. Jo studied him, something unreadable flickering across her face. "I need to check on Mia," she finally said, moving past him toward the living room. That evening, after Mia was asleep, Jo emerged onto the balcony where Gabriel sat watching the city lights. She carried 2 mugs of tea, offering one silently, before settling into the adjacent chair. "Mia asked if we could stay here forever," Jo said after a long moment. "She thinks you have the best books and the best view of the stars." Gabriel smiled faintly. "She's welcome to both any time." "Gabriel," Jo sighed. "What is this? What are we doing?" The question encompassed far more than their temporary living arrangement. Gabriel considered his response carefully, aware that the delicate trust between them hung in the balance. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I only know that meeting you, seeing how you move through the world with such integrity despite every obstacle, it woke something in me that I thought was long dead." Jo's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained. "And the help you've been arranging behind the scenes, the tutoring scholarship, the child care service, was that about me, or about you feeling better about yourself?" The question stung with its accuracy. Gabriel had never examined his motives so closely. "Maybe both," he acknowledged. "Is that so terrible?" Jo stared out at the city below. "I built my life on never needing anyone. After Daniel left, I promised myself I'd never be vulnerable like that again." She turned to face him directly. "Do you know what it's like to discover that the safety nets you thought were just good luck were actually someone pulling strings without your knowledge?" Gabriel winced. "I never meant to undermine your independence." "But you did," Jo said, her voice gentle despite the accusation. "You made choices about my life, about Mia's life, without giving me the dignity of participation." The truth of her words hit Gabriel with unexpected force. In his world, problems were solved with resources and influence, efficient, effective, and emotionless. Jo's perspective illuminated the fundamental flaw in his approach. In trying to ease her burdens, he had inadvertently diminished her agency. "You're right," he said simply. "I'm sorry." Jo seemed startled by his unqualified acceptance of her critique. She'd clearly expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger. Her expression softened further. "The strangest part is," she continued, "I'm grateful for the help. Mia's thriving with that tutoring program. I sleep better knowing she's safe with community childcare when I work late." She shook her head. I'm angry about how it happened, not that it happened. Gabriel nodded, understanding the nuanced distinction. What can I do to make it right? Joe considered the question seriously. Be honest with me, completely honest. No more half-truths or omissions. All right, Gabriel agreed, recognizing the significance of this moment. What do you want to know? Everything, Joe said simply. Who you really are, why you really kept coming to that diner, what you want from us. Gabriel took a deep breath, then began speaking with a candor he'd shown no one in years. He told her about building his investment firm from nothing, about the loneliness that had crept in as success grew, about the hollow victory of acquiring everything while connecting to nothing. He explained how their first interaction, her genuine smile amid obvious exhaustion, had affected him, making him question the sterile perfection of his carefully constructed life. I kept coming back because you reminded me what it meant to live with purpose, he finished quietly. Not just to exist, but to matter to someone. Joe listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she remained silent for several moments before responding. You know, most single mothers would consider a wealthy, kind man interested in them to be a stroke of incredible luck, she said with a small smile. I've spent so long being fiercely self-reliant that I forgot sometimes it's okay to accept help. And sometimes it's okay to need people, Gabriel added softly. Their eyes met in the gentle darkness, understanding passing between them. Not forgiveness. Precisely. The situation was too complex for such simple resolution. But acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. The moment was interrupted by Joe's phone chiming with an email notification. She glanced at it, then stiffened. What is it? Gabriel asked, immediately concerned. Riverside Market is closing permanently, Joe said, her voice hollow. The flood damage was too extensive, and the owner's insurance apparently lapsed last month. She looked up, panic flashing briefly across her features. That's half my income gone. Gabriel's instinct was immediate, to offer money security solutions, but he recognized the trap he'd fallen into before. Instead, he simply asked, What do you need from me right now? The question seemed to surprise Joe. She considered it, seriously, before answering. Just this, a safe place to think, to regroup, and maybe... She hesitated. Maybe some advice from someone who understands business better than I do. Gabriel nodded, respecting the boundary she'd established. You have both for as long as you need. The next morning, they drove together to the condemned apartment building. Gabriel waited in the car with Mia while Joe, accompanied by a safety inspector, entered to salvage what she could. She emerged 30 minutes later with 2 small bags, her expression resolute but devastated. Most of it was unsalvageable, she explained as they drove back to Gabriel's condominium. The water reached nearly to the ceiling. In the back seat, Mia clutched a sodden book of constellations, its pages warped but precious. At least we got my star book, she said with forced cheerfulness that broke Gabriel's heart. That evening, after Mia was asleep, Gabriel found Joe sitting at his kitchen counter, papers spread before her. Job listings, apartment ads, budget calculations, the architecture of rebuilding a life. May I join you? Gabriel asked, careful not to presume. Joe nodded, pushing aside some papers to make room. They worked in companionable silence, Joe searching listings while Gabriel reviewed insurance documents she'd salvaged. Occasionally, one would ask the other a question or offer an observation, the collaborative process feeling surprisingly natural. As midnight approached, Joe sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. I never thanked you properly, she said quietly. For taking us in for all of it. You don't need to thank me, Gabriel replied. Having you both here. He hesitated, then continued with newfound honesty. It's the first time this place has felt like more than just expensive square footage. Joe studied him thoughtfully. You know, for a millionaire CEO, you're surprisingly lonely. The observation, delivered without judgment, struck Gabriel with its accuracy. And for someone so determinedly self-sufficient, you're surprisingly good at caring for others beyond just Mia. A smile tugged at Joe's lips. Maybe we both have something to learn from each other. In that moment, amid scattered papers and uncertain futures, Gabriel recognized that what had begun as an impulse to help someone facing struggles had evolved into something far more significant. A chance to rediscover connection, purpose, and possibly, though neither was ready to name it yet, a different kind of love than either had known before. Building Bridges' spring sunshine streamed through the windows of Hearth and Home Cafe as Joe wiped down the gleaming counter. The morning rush had subsided, leaving a pleasant hum of conversation from the few remaining customers. She paused to adjust a display of freshly baked muffins, satisfaction warming her chest as she surveyed what she had built over the past 8 months. After the flood had taken nearly everything, Joe had faced a crossroads. The obvious path, accepting Gabriel's financial help and the security it offered, had tempted her during those uncertain days. Instead, they had forged something more meaningful, a partnership built on mutual respect rather than rescue. Ducat Cafe had been Gabriel's suggestion, but every aspect of its creation had been collaborative. When he proposed using his business connections to secure the perfect location in a developing neighborhood, Joe had countered with her own stipulation. She would repay every dollar as a proper business loan with reasonable interest. The terms they negotiated had been fair, honoring both his resources and her independence. More coffee, Professor Willis? Joe asked the elderly man who had become a morning regular, his tweed jacket and spectacles as much a fixture as the local artwork adorning the walls. Please, my dear, he replied, pushing his empty cup forward. And perhaps one of those blueberry scones. My wife insists they're better than hers, though I'd never tell her so. Joe laughed, serving him with the genuine warmth that had made Hearth and Home a neighborhood favorite. The cafe's success had surprised everyone except Gabriel, who had recognized Joe's natural talent for creating spaces where people felt welcomed and valued, the same gift she had demonstrated even during her exhausted shifts at the Bluebird. The meal bell above the door chimed, and Joe looked up to see Mia bursting in, backpack bouncing, followed by Gabriel carrying a science project that appeared to be a meticulously constructed model of the solar system. Mom, Mia called, hurrying to the counter. I got an A+. Ms. Hernandez said my presentation on orbital mechanics was the best she's ever heard from a third grader. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Joe beamed, coming around the counter to examine the project. She met Gabriel's eyes over Mia's head, sharing a moment of quiet pride. I bet Gabriel helped with the technical details. Actually, Gabriel said, carefully setting down the delicate model, Mia corrected my calculations on Jupiter's orbit. I think we may have an astrophysicist in the making. Mia grinned, her confidence having blossomed remarkably over these months. Gabriel said we could visit the planetarium this weekend to celebrate. Can you come too, Mom? I wouldn't miss it, Joe promised, smoothing her daughter's curls. Nadine is covering the Saturday afternoon shift. The easy domesticity of this exchange, the three of them navigating schedules, sharing triumphs, still occasionally caught Joe by surprise. After the flood, she had initially accepted Gabriel's offer to stay in his condominium temporarily, maintaining careful boundaries while she developed her business plan. But temporary arrangements had evolved, walls had softened, and what began as crisis management had transformed into something neither had anticipated. How was the investment meeting? Joe asked Gabriel as Mia settled at her usual corner table with homework. Productive, Gabriel replied, accepting the coffee Joe automatically prepared for him. The sustainable energy portfolio is outperforming projections, and the Community Development Fund has identified 3 more flood-affected businesses for recovery grants. This too had been unexpected, the way Gabriel's business priorities had shifted since their lives had intertwined. Pearson Investments still managed billions but now allocated significant resources toward community resilience and economic accessibility. The corporate titan hadn't disappeared, but he had rediscovered the human purpose behind the wealth. Nadine, called earlier, Joe said, leaning against the counter beside him. She's interested in the assistant manager position. She'd be perfect, Gabriel observed. Experienced, reliable, good with customers. Joe nodded. And it would free me up to develop The catering side of the business. She hesitated, then added, and maybe finally take that business administration course. Gabriel's expression softened with pride. You'll excel at it, just like everything else you tackle. The easy confidence in his voice, not patronizing but genuinely appreciative of her capabilities, was something Joe had come to treasure. Unlike Daniel, whose support had always felt conditional, Gabriel's belief in her remained steady whether she succeeded brilliantly or stumbled occasionally. The afternoon flowed in its familiar pattern, Joe managing the cafe, Gabriel working, on his laptop at the corner table, occasionally consulting her on decisions or taking calls outside to avoid disturbing customers. Mia completed her homework, helped with simple tasks, and charmed regulars with her enthusiastic explanations of scientific concepts. As closing time approached, Professor Willis approached the counter with his empty cup and a knowing smile. You've created something special here, Josephine, he said, gesturing around the warm space. Not just a business, but a community. Joe smiled, glancing toward Gabriel and Mia, who were engaged in an animated discussion involving napkin diagrams. I had help. Yes, the professor agreed, following her gaze. But the remarkable thing is how you've helped each other become more fully yourselves. He patted her hand. That's rarer than you might think. After the last customer departed and Mia had been entrusted with turning the open sign to closed, Joe joined Gabriel at his table. I've been thinking, she said, uncharacteristically hesitant. Gabriel looked up attentively. About? The apartment above the cafe is finally finished with renovations, Joe said, tracing patterns on the wooden tabletop. It makes sense for Mia and me to move in. The commute would be simpler. We could reduce overhead by combining living and business space. She trailed off as she registered Gabriel's carefully neutral expression. That's logical, he agreed, his tone measured. The timing works well with your lease ending next month. Joe studied him, recognizing the careful control he exercised when emotions threatened his composure. Over months of growing closeness, she had learned to read the subtle signs others missed. There's another option, she continued quietly. One I've been considering for a while now. Gabriel waited, his patience another quality Joe had come to appreciate. We could stay, she said simply. Not as emergency guests or temporary residents, but properly. Together. The shift in Gabriel's expression was subtle but profound. Hope carefully contained as though afraid to fully emerge. You and Mia have created a home in what was just an expensive box, he said softly. I can't imagine returning to how it was before. I need you to understand something, Joe continued, her gaze direct. If we do this, make it official, blend our lives completely. I'm not looking for financial rescue. My business is growing. I'm standing on my own feet. Gabriel nodded, understanding the importance of this distinction. What are you looking for, then? Joe considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Partnership, balance, the way we've been these past months, where your strengths complement my weaknesses and vice versa. She smiled slightly. And maybe admitting that what started as circumstance has become choice. Choice, Gabriel repeated, the word carrying weight. I've spent my life making strategic decisions, but choosing to love you and Mia is the only one that's ever felt completely right. The word love hung between them. Not the first time it had been spoken, but perhaps the most significant. Joe reached across the table, taking his hand. We've been building a bridge from opposite sides, she said. I think it's finally strong enough to meet in the middle. From the doorway to the kitchen, Mia's voice interrupted their moment. Does this mean Gabriel is staying forever? Because I already told everyone at school he's part of our family. And Gabriel exchanged startled glances before breaking into laughter. Mia approached, her expression serious despite their amusement. Well, she pressed, are we a real family now? Gabriel looked to Joe, deferring to her as he always did in matters concerning Mia. Joe's heart swelled with appreciation for this consistent respect. We're figuring that out, Joe answered honestly. How would you feel if we were? Good, Mia said decisively. Gabriel needs us. He was really lonely before, even with all his money and his big apartment. And we need him too, not because of the money stuff, but because he makes you smile more, Mom. And he explains black holes really well. The simple wisdom of children, Joe thought, could cut through complications adults created. She met Gabriel's gaze over Mia's head, finding it warm with shared understanding. Later that evening, after they had returned to the condominium that had gradually transformed from Gabriel's sterile showcase to their shared home, Joe stood at the balcony railing, watching the city lights. Gabriel joined her, offering a mug of tea. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Joe accepted the tea with a grateful smile. "I was thinking about that first night at the diner when you ordered meatloaf and barely spoke 10 words. I was intimidated by you," Gabriel admitted with a small laugh. "You had this dignity, this integrity that made my wealth seem meaningless. And I thought you were just a quiet businessman who tipped well," Joe replied, leaning slightly against him. "We've come a long way." Gabriel nodded, his arms settling around her shoulders. "You know, when I first started coming to the diner, I thought perhaps I could help improve your circumstances. I never imagined you would completely transform mine." Joe considered this. "That's the difference between charity and connection," she said finally. "One maintains distance while alleviating symptoms. The other bridges gaps and addresses causes." "The businesswoman and the philosopher," Gabriel murmured appreciatively. "You continue to surprise me." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city below. The same view they had shared during those tense days after the flood, now imbued with entirely different meaning. "The cafe expansion plans are ready," Gabriel said eventually. "Your idea for the community kitchen space to offer culinary training for single parents is brilliant, and your foundation's commitment to fund the first year of operations makes it possible," Joe acknowledged. "See? Partnership." Gabriel turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about partnership too, in all its forms." Something in his tone made Joe meet his gaze directly. The question in his eyes was clear, though he hadn't voiced it. "Mia asked if we're a real family," Joe said softly. "I think perhaps we have been for some time now, just without admitting it." Gabriel's smile was gentle. "I don't need declarations or certificates, Joe. Having you both in my life, building something meaningful together, that's more than I ever hoped for." Joe reached up to touch his face, the gesture tender. "The lonely millionaire and the overworked waitress," she said with a hint of amusement. "Who would have thought?" "I did," came Mia's voice from the doorway where she stood in pajamas decorated with planets. "From the first time Gabriel came to the apartment after the flood. He looked at you the way Dad never did, like you were the most important person in the universe." Joe and Gabriel exchanged glances, simultaneously amused and moved by Mia's perception. Joe extended her hand, inviting her daughter to join them. "Is that so, astronomy expert?" Gabriel asked as Mia nestled between them. "Yep," Mia confirmed confidently. "It's basic science. Some things just belong together, like the Earth and the Moon. Different sizes, but they make a perfect system." As the three of them stood together, gazing at the city spread below them, Joe reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. From exhausted shifts serving a quiet stranger, to crisis and shelter, to building a business and now a life together. None of it following any path she could have anticipated. The bridges they had built, between wealth and work, between independence and intimacy, between past wounds and future possibilities, hadn't erased their differences. Gabriel still occasionally slipped into fixing problems with resources rather than presence. Joe sometimes retreated into self-sufficiency when vulnerability would serve better. But these differences had become strengths in their shared life, each complementing the other's gaps. "Look," Mia pointed upward, where stars were becoming visible despite the city lights. "You can see Orion." Joe and Gabriel followed her gesture, their gazes lifting to the night sky. The same vastness that had first given them common ground in brief conversations at the diner. "Some things are constant," Gabriel murmured, his arm tightening around Joe's shoulders. no matter how much everything else changes. In that moment, surrounded by the family they had built from unlikely beginnings, Joe understood that the most valuable thing Gabriel had ever given her wasn't financial security or business opportunities. It was the space to redefine strength, not as the capacity to need no one, but as the courage to build bridges across differences, creating connections strong enough to weather any storm. And what she had given him in return was equally precious: the knowledge that his worth extended far beyond his wealth, that his greatest asset wasn't what he owned but how he loved. Together, they had discovered that sometimes the most unexpected crossings lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that true wealth isn't measured in accounts or properties, but in the bridges we build to reach each other.